institution that is thousands of years old that influences each of our lives daily, whether it be in the future, the present, or the past. And yet, most of us don't even know the historical origins of marriage. So I'm here to explain to you the history of marriage. The origins of marriage are often disputed, but are generally believed to have begun in the ancient world with Judaism, with marriage being included as part of their covenant with God. At this point in time, women were tied to men to ensure them biological heirs, and the woman would therefore become the man's property. This time period also saw the beginnings of double standards for men and women, with adulterous women receiving the death penalty while the male would incur no such punishment. In ancient Greek times, women were similarly bound to men for these reasons, but also to establish strategic alliances by connecting powerful families. This time period in particular saw the oppression of women, with females being confined to a domestic role. Many men, such as Xenophon, saw women's roles as being important, but still assigned them this role based off biological traits. Others saw women as being inferior, such as Aristotle, who described women as an imperfect male, but also believed in marriage as being fundamental for a healthy state. Regardless of attitudes towards them, there can be no doubt that women had absolutely no control over their lives. Additionally, with their chaireia, or ownership and authority, passing from their fathers to their husband upon marriage. Most women were unable to leave their houses, confined to a domestic role for fear of adultery, which would throw the legitimacy of their heirs into question. Women were also seen as unable to control their desires, and thus their husbands protected them with strict rules about dress and drinking. From there, most major reforms to the rite of marriage in the Western world occurred with Christianity. Dowries, also known as the money, goods or estate that is passed on from the woman's family to the husband upon marriage, became prevalent, as emphasis was placed even further on the purchasing of women. In 8th century Europe in particular, women would literally surrender their identity through giving up their maiden name, and it can be seen that throughout this period of history, women's family names were always defined by males. The Council of Trent also saw marriage being recognised as a sacrament, and the closer tying of the institution to this religion did allow for the better protection of women, as men were no longer able to divorce wives easily and were encouraged to show greater respect. However, many marriages were still not founded in love, but were instead focused on procreation, highlighted in the thinking of St. Augustine, who considered sex for pleasure as sinful. This focus on marriage for procreation did establish women as being necessary to society. However, it also meant that barren women would be considered useless and treated horribly. Another issue with marriage during the Middle Ages included that consent consisted of the couple just being present at the ceremony. However, in the 11th century, this was reformed so that couples needed to give verbal consent as they must today. The first time that divorce was actually recognised by law was in 1858, and this allowed women to extricate themselves from abusive husbands. On the other hand, proving that a woman had grounds for divorce was difficult and the process was expensive. Marriage at this point in time was also only recognised with couples being married in a church or chapel by a minister, reflecting the influence of the church in the 18th century and how the rite, even at this point, did not reflect the union of all people. It was only in 1836 that the Civil Marriage Act was passed to allow non-religious civil marriages. It was also in the Victorian era that love really entered the equation as the basis for marriage, prominent in art forms during this time period. From here, women generally continued to be oppressed within marriages, before major milestones were reached in terms of women's rights. The introduction of feminism in the 19th century and women gaining the right to vote helped with women winning back their individual identity. Birth control and contraception similarly helped to separate marriage from procreation and helped women to work towards a society to which they could contribute to. Same-sex marriage rights have also had a lengthy progression over time. In the US, the issue was being contested as early as the 1970s, but the first major step towards marriage equality took place in 1989, with Denmark becoming the first country to recognise same-sex unions as what's called registered partnerships. This led to the Netherlands legalising full marriage equality in 2001. Other countries in Northern Europe quickly followed suit, despite backlash from the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, in the US, Hawaii suggested that denying same-sex marriage might be sex discrimination, and therefore unconstitutional in a landmark case in the Supreme Court. Feeling threatened by the approaching marriage equality, the US government passed the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996, an act now called by Obama as indefensible, which explicitly defined marriage as being between a man and a woman. Following 2003, when Massachusetts ruled that the DOMA was unconstitutional and allowed marriage equality in their state, the fight for marriage equality in the US has been largely state-based, with 30 states having legalized it in 2014. Disparity across generations was observed in all countries. In general, younger people were more tolerant than older people. After the Canadian reform in 2004, marriage equality became a matter of public debate in Australia, leading to the Marriage Legislation Amendment Bill, which is basically the Australian Defence of Marriage Act. Marriage equality was first legalised by popular vote by Ireland in 2015, even though there was considerable disagreement among members of the Catholic Church. Despite this, the Archbishop of Dublin came out in support of gay rights. And now, in an unnecessarily complicated and lengthy process, Australia has finally legalised marriage equality. In today's society, marriage is a lot less tied to religion in the Western world, with in Australia only 27% of weddings being religious. Divorce is obviously more normalised, with 1 in 3 marriages ending in divorce, and with the average marriage only lasting 12.1 years. People are also less afraid to remarry, with 1 in 5 people being married more than once. Overall, the statistics suggest that our society regards marriage very differently than how it did even 30 years ago. Despite there being this progression in the institution of marriage over this extensive time period, it is still concerning that many of the rights so inextricably linked to oppressive attitudes from long ago still are widely practiced today. So, how will marriage progress in the future, and how will you contribute towards that?